Hi, and welcome to week 5, and we will be heading into, of course, week 6, which is our midterm. Now, because this is the week 6 has a holiday, which is July 4th, I've opened up the proctored exam so that you can take it from now until midnight on July 3rd. So you will be able to go in and access the eProctor or ProctorU so that you can go ahead and take the midterm. However, before you take the midterm, I would recommend that you go ahead and go into the assignments area of the class, and you can go ahead and see what week 5 is going to entail. Week 5 is really about focusing on the modern short stories. You will see that you're going to be reading some Ernest Hemingway and, of course, some F. Scott Fitzgerald, who are two of the stalwarts of the modernist canon. I would highly recommend that you also review any of your notes and go ahead and look at week 6 in the discussion area, because I have went ahead and included a study guide that you can complete and submit it to me if you'd like some feedback, and you can bring that with you into the final, or not the final, I'm sorry, into the midterm so that you can use it as your notes. Remember, you can bring your notes and you can bring your book with you into the midterm test. So like I said, go ahead and make sure that you are comfortable with the midterm, and that you are going to go ahead and review the materials and make sure that you're prepared, of course, before you go in. Now, this last week, week 4, we did read some, as many of you remarked, some very tough poetry. And the modern poetry that we read is markedly different than the Paul Laurence Dunbar poetry that we read from before. And of course, it is also markedly different from some of the other more accessible stories that we engaged in realism and, of course, in naturalism. Going back to what we talked about before with M.H. Abrams and his notion of the 4 areas of interpreting literature, and that you interpret the work, you interpret the biography or the author, you interpret the reader, or you interpret the culture at large surrounding the text. You can see how in many ways the realistic writers were about the author and the reader, and these modernist writers seem to be much more focused on the culture at the time. And many of you did remark on this in your postings. In fact, to begin, Sherry really did a good observation of her and her reading of the structure in the poetry. In particular, she engaged the poetry from Marianne Moore and, of course, Ezra Pound. Christopher built on this, and he really did focus on the expatriate movement. Some of you did mention this in your post, that a lot of these American writers did travel abroad, and this was a very large rite of passage for many of our writers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to go abroad and, of course, to work and to be exposed to the greats. Much like a grand tour that was very popular in the late 1700s and early 1800s with the artists in America too. Joseph, you had an excellent post. You really did have a lot of interaction with this post. I could see many people reading it and engaging it, and I encourage you to keep going in that depth as you go into the midterm. Kevin, a lovely interpretation of Pounds in the Station of the Metro, which many of you remarked is only 14 words but contains so much power, and that you really did focus on the notion of movement, this notion of rushing through life. The power of the image. And this is very much related to Ezra Pound's focus on being part of the Imagist movement. The Imagists really did focus on trying to capture the image of life at the time that would explode and show more about that moment from an exalted and expanded perspective. And I like that you kind of hit at that in your reading. John, you really focused on that, like I said, the large picture of the culture, and that you saw that most of these poets were really upset about the decline of Western civilization, a lot of doom and gloom. It was kind of dark, but that you did mention you wouldn't want to sit at a bar with Eliot. Probably not. He was a little bit on the bizarre side. Charlene, you focused on the idea of reading and rereading, and remember, as I've mentioned many times before, and as Vladimir Nabokov says, all good reading is rereading, and that really is what this class kind of boils down to, is engaging the text in such a way that you encounter it as an interrogative experience instead of just as a transmission of knowledge. Um, I also like that Charlene also focused in her post, which was really solid and good, on the decline of Western civilization being echoed and mimicked in these poetries. Melvin, I like that you focused once again, like John and like Kevin, in this notion that these poets were painting a picture of the image in the poetry. And like I said, this goes very much back to the Imagists and their poetry and poetic movements. Ryan, nice observation with the idea that poetry is the unguided tour. It's short bursts of words, and that you really did focus on the excellent qualities in this poetry. Ashlyn, I really appreciated your ideas focused on the fragmentation that seems to operate in the poetry, and the fragmentation that you see in the poetic structure is also referencing a tenet of modernism, which is the fragmented reality experienced as a result of the alienation and exile in light of the modern period. The idea that notions of the mind and control of self are gone with Freud, notions of the responsibility of one in a democratic society are being questioned, a la Marx. And then, of course, you have Friedrich Nietzsche, and you have Charles Darwin's works being very much prolific and questioning the very essence of God as a religious figure, and also questioning the notion of our place on this earth. So this fragmented quality and this alienation and exile that results from it also works its way into the poetry. Jason, I like that you, like many others, expressed the difficulty that you felt with this poetry. And that is perfectly fine to express that difficulty and to really think about, what does it mean to get through this work and understand it. And I think that it's okay to struggle a bit. All good readers and engagers of literature do struggle with the literature, and it's okay to be there. Sarah also express this difficulty, but you had a very good reading of The River Merchant's Wife. You had a lot of good observations, and I could see that you were pulling out some meaning from that. Ansley, I really enjoyed that you pointed out the irony in Moore's poetry, and it really is, it's not a surface read. It's an in-depth exploration and even an exculpation of her own work as a poet and how she kind of sees the futility in what she's doing, but at the same time sees the fecundity of being that kind of writer. I also like that you mentioned a very humorous take on her work, and you also mentioned that you enjoyed The Wasteland and that this was part and parcel of some of the texts that you were exposed to while you were in high school. And I'm so glad to hear that you were exposed to these because in many ways The Wasteland is very much a hypertext type document, and that each of the words do refer back and forward to historical moments, cultural icons, mythological concepts and constructs, and so it really does take a depth of knowledge to see the links that this text is going to. Megan, great reading of Pound, and I love that you once again mentioned that the idea that 14 words can be so packed with so much information. Philip, you too had a great reading of Pound's Metro, and I really like that Jessica even mentioned the importance of reading bios like Ezra Pound's bio when she was engaging the works, because it did allow a little bit more when you learned a bit more about the author for that. Christopher, I would urge you with your postings to be a little more in-depth. Take a look at some of your peers and really see how they're going beyond just the surface of the reading, and they're really thinking about what is this text doing, and why am I reading it, and why am I reading it in this section, and how does it really demonstrate these tenets. Jennifer, I love that you pointed out the idea that Pound's work has no verbs. That's a great call out, and shows a real keen focus on the literature and on your reading. Mark, you had a very powerful interpretation, and I like that you focused on the idea of short and simple, with that kind of being where you feel comfortable with poetry. Roderick, I really appreciate your call out and attention to the challenges that you felt between reading poetry and modern poetry and traditional poetry. And like I said, it's okay to have those tense moments, because that really is what becoming kind of a thinker, or a um, literary reader, or a reader who's focused on making meaning out of these texts, really does come down to that awareness of the challenge. Edmund, I love that you mentioned we don't admire what we cannot understand. I think that's a great point to be made, and I think it really does dovetail nicely into what we've been talking about in this section. Jonathan, thank you very much for mentioning the difficulty. I can see that, like many others, you do have that, and you can kind of keep focusing beyond it. Jordan, I appreciate that you mentioned the importance of breaking apart the stanza and the lines. I think one of the best things you can do with poetry is to isolate maybe a phrase, or maybe isolate a couple lines, and just go line by line and word by word and ask yourself, what does this mean? Why is this being used? How is it being used? What does it say? And really give a close reading, which can be very fruitful. Um, Forrest, I appreciate that you mentioned the Holy Grail as a theme, or as a symbolic structure that does relate to the wasteland, and the Grail myth, along with the Fisher King myth, is one that's very affiliated with the wasteland. Lindsay, you had a great reading of Marianne Moore, and like Jeremy, he kind of dovetailed on to what you said. He said that he felt you needed a secret decoder ring on how to interpret poetry. Like I mentioned, poetry is like anything else. It takes a little bit of practice, and you have to get a little bit of a mindset going. It doesn't just allow you to passively engage it. It really asks for that work and that engagement of the text. And so it does take that close reading, those questions, that kind of response. I usually have to read a poem anywhere from 4 to 7 times before I really feel kind of like I'm getting anywhere with it. So you're not alone with that. Vance mentioned the idea of the expatriates, which he talked a little bit about. And of course, he mentioned Greek mythology and other mythological instances in the poetry, which then Charles presented in his posting with the idea that poetry often has hidden meanings. Jason mentioned that he did a lot of pre-reading and looking at the footnotes, which is a great strategy for really thinking and learning about poetry. And Camellia mentioned the reading and rereading that we've also chit-chatted about. Corey had an excellent post. There was great use of evidence. If any of you are kind of feeling still a little bit uncomfortable with posting, I strongly encourage you to look at Carrie's. His post was absolutely fantastic, and I think it's really solid. So Carrie had a great post and a good sample. Um, Gregory really mentioned the idea that in Eliot it was kind of about the seasons and maybe even reshaping the seasons, and that's a great read because it really is about that transition through life, and seasons are a great metaphor for that. Emily had a great reading of The River's Merchant's Wife with a focus on the themes of love and, of course, moving forward. Um, Quenisha mentioned the imagery of the train. It was captured in Pound, this idea of movement, which does fit with, as we've mentioned, that imagistic movement. Juan mentioned that he loves to read shorter poetry, and he actually liked reading William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow, which is something I think is a great text, and I do encourage you to read it. Miranda mentioned the power of the image, and Chandra mentioned, of course, the imagery in Eliot, and kind of really focused on that. Now, as I mentioned, what you are going to be doing for the week 5 is you will be reading 2 lessons. One is, of course, on the short stories. You'll be reading Sherwood Anderson, Weinsberg and Hands in Volume D, Catherine Ann Porter's Flowering Judas, Hemingway's The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and Fitzgerald's Babylon Revisited. In Lesson 9, which is also this week, you'll be reading a little more poetry, which is E. Cummings, Cambridge Ladies, Next to God, Wallace Stevens, Sunday Morning, Hilda Doolittle, or H.D. You'll be reading Leda and Helen, William Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow, and Spring and All. And you'll be reading Robert Frost, The Mending Wall and Stopping by Woods. Week 6, you have no readings, or discussion postings. So basically, you have from now, which is the 24th, through the 3rd to do those readings and to take your midterm. You also have until, so week 6 will end on the 6th of July, and that's when we'll start our next, which will be week 7. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thanks.